Welcome to Pensar Basketball Live, and today we're going to be talking about how we got here, where we're going, how dire is it, and we're certainly going to talk about this image and many other images because lost in the emotion of a losing season, lost in the controversy of whether Scotty Barnes should be suspended or what his body language is like, lost in all the fighting and infighting and debates, is that the Toronto Raptors have probably, likely, gone all in on a player that they believe is a future all-timer and a really great player. How great is he? Well, he's making a little bit of history right now. First of all, as a Rookie of the Year in 2022 for the 2021 draft, he ended up becoming one of 3 Raptors all-time. This is a team that's been pretty bad. They've drafted high a lot, so it's a big deal. He was one of 3 Raptors to win Rookie of the Year, and he becomes just a second Raptor to not only win Rookie of the Year, but then go on to hit that second box of becoming an All-Star. So we're going to talk about the gamble that the Raptors have made, how we got here, and what exactly needs to go right, and when the Raptors can expect to compete on Scotty Barnes' timeline. A lot of coded messages have been delivered from ex-teammates and people who've been shipped out. People like Pascal Siakam, people like Fred VanVleet, about this was inevitable. They were always going to go that way once they picked that timeline. And I can hear a lot of Raptor fans are very, very frustrated. They're frustrated because they don't feel that this is a certain outcome. It doesn't feel as certain as we got to go all in on Luka Doncic, right? Some franchises passed the torch from one all-time great to another. The Mavericks certainly had a chance to pass the torch from Dirk Nowitzki, and shortly thereafter, they had Luka Doncic. The San Antonio Spurs had Tim Duncan, and when he was done, they had Kawhi Leonard. Some franchises, they toil. They toil in mediocrity for a long time. Look at the Chicago Bulls. They had the greatest player of all time in Michael Jordan, and then they just kept looking for the next one for a very long time. It wasn't Ron Mercer. It wasn't Tony Kukoc. It certainly wasn't Jamal Crawford and Marcus Fizer. They thought it might have been Jay Williams in 2002. I distinctly remember that Jay Williams took Michael Jordan's locker, and when pushed on it, he said, well, we haven't been winning while this locker is empty. Well, they wouldn't win thereafter either. The Bulls, Baby Bulls experiment with Tyson Chandler and Eddie Curry yielded very few results. Those two guys had more successful careers elsewhere, and Tyson Chandler ended up winning a championship with the aforementioned Dirk Nowitzki. But ultimately, the Raptors have tried and failed many times to pass the torch. They passed the torch from Vince Carter to Chris Bosh. How did that go? Did that go super well? No. They won 3 playoff games, and Chris Bosh ended up becoming more of a second, third option. And before he unfortunately had to retire, he, he's had a Hall of Fame career. He's a great player, but 3 playoff games in 7 years with Chris Bosh was no one's idea of success. Are the Raptors going that way? Certainly, previous regimes have bet on players that had more consistent pathways to success than Scotty Barnes. DeMar DeRozan, really, really hype prospect. You could sort of see it, right? I mean, the jump shot was shaky. The playmaking was a little bit shaky. The defense was a question. There's a lot of questions about DeMar DeRozan. They tried a little bit with Rudy Gay. The point is, the Raptors have tried and failed successfully and unsuccessfully to build around the right player and the wrong player many times. And a lot of Raptor fans right now believe that they're building around a flawed prospect. They probably believe that the pathway to Scotty Barnes being a first option on a really good team is difficult. And I agree. It is difficult for sure. He's not a surefire 100%, 30 point per game scorer. He's not necessarily showing you right now that he can lead a winning team. And so I wanted to kind of dissect how the Raptors came to the conclusion that they came to, as my phone continues to go off and off and off and off. I apologize. Those are Pendants orders going off, and if you stay tuned, I'll give you a nice little gift from the Pendants Film Festival. This is my phone all day. It's been going off and off and off. A lot of orders today, which is great. Um, this is going to keep going off, and I apologize. I'm not used to my phone going off this much, so I'm just going to mute this. Hang on one second. Mute, 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 because it is very distracting for you and for me. Phew, saved. So I want to talk about how we got here. First of all, are fans right to be concerned? I was curious about how right Raptor fans have been about Scotty Barnes the entire way through, and I got to tell you, take a look at this. This is the immediate reaction right after Scotty was drafted. Does this look like like it's funny. It's a little bit funny, right? When you really think about it, it's a little bit hilarious that the same people that didn't want him drafted saying that Suggs would be, I mean, Jalen Suggs' chances of being an all-star at any point in his career, given the talent level of this league, much less a superstar, much less a franchise player, are virtually zero at this point, maybe 1%. So it seems like this front office bet on Scotty Barnes becoming that good. And amidst a very terrible season for the Raptors in terms of team success, Scotty Barnes is proving them right again. So I want to talk about where he's come from, how he's come this far, and where he's going to. I want to talk about how the Raptors, the roster turnover is crazy. Seeing Pascal Siakam back yesterday or the day before, when he came back to Toronto yesterday, Valentine's Day. Well, it's 2 days ago because it's Friday. Was very unsettling in a way too. It's almost like you look at the TV and Pascal Siakam's in a Pacers jersey and Fred VanVleet's not here and OG's not here. And you're just like, whoa, how did this happen so fast? It's like we were dissecting who we wanted in a trade. We are complaining about Jakob Poeltl's trade, coming to save Fred VanVleet's contract. And, a year later, exactly, and almost no one is here anymore. And the whole thing has shifted. And I guess it would be probably pertinent to start with when the Raptors started scouting Scotty Barnes. This was Scotty Barnes, Team USA, U16. And, he's come such a long way that if you followed his jersey for as long, if you followed his journey for as long as I have, you would be pretty miffed because every single time you thought that he couldn't do something, there he was the next year doing that same thing that you thought he couldn't do. And I gotta tell you, at 16, 17, 18, there was a lot of talk about Scotty Barnes being a really, really good defensive prospect, but not an offensive one. A number 3, or number 4, maybe like a guy that you pick in the middle of the first round that anchors your defense a little bit. Think about guys like Day'Ron Sharpe, Nick Claxton, Jared Allen. Think about guys like maybe Draymond Green. This is the kind of prospect that no team has ever tried to build around. No one has ever projected these players as stars or superstars. They're role players. And effectively, that's what Scotty Barnes was to some extent. But that's not what he saw himself as. And, the pathway from this player to this player is immense. And you have to trust that. You have to trust that these people don't know as much as these people. You have to understand that this work that he's done and this family that's raised him has made him into this. You got to trust that. And you got to trust that he has his sights set a little bit higher than his other guys who won Rookie of the Year with him. But instead of dancing around the timeline, let's look at it a little bit more linearly. He gets drafted out of Florida State. A lot of people say, my gosh, Jalen Suggs, what the hell? What are you guys doing? Shout outs to Jin Tarjo, this really positive comment in the middle of all of these negative comments of wows and Jalen Suggs and L and all that stuff. This guy's saying, man, we got a good one. He saw, I saw, Masai saw, Bobby Webster saw. They saw something special in this kid. And I think they saw a willingness to work. See, you've been doing this as long as Masai Ujiri and Bobby Webster have. You learn to see a little ahead, right? And that's really where you become successful. You don't become successful at drafting or managing a team because you can evaluate what is. You become successful by evaluating what can be, what will be, the likelihood of something happening, the contingency plan, everything. It's about risk management, but it's also about projection. It's about being optimistic, but it's also about being realistic. And I guess a lot of people don't believe that this young man right here had any chance of becoming this young man. And I think even when he won Rookie of the Year, that if I had told you that by year 3 he would be an all-star, I think a lot of people would have said, I wouldn't bet on that. Scotty himself said yesterday he hadn't really thought about it. I think people misconstrued that. He talked about on his draft night, during his draft interview, he said, I think I can be one of the greatest, if not the greatest player in the NBA. Or did he say it the other way? I think he said, oh, I can be the greatest, one of the greatest players in the NBA. I think he has his sights set high, but don't sleep on the fact that he can always adjust. He can always set them higher. And obviously, the player that he was at Florida State, the player that they drafted, is not the player who entered his rookie season. You know, a lot could be determined about how you approach your rookie season. A lot of people don't expect very much from rookies as is. And I don't think anyone would have blamed him if he came out and had a Patrick Williams type of impact, or even a Jonathan Kuminga type of impact, or a James Wiseman type of impact. Hey, you reached on a guy that a lot of people thought was a project. It was going to be a development path line. I don't think most people would have overly panicked, being crazy, actually. I don't think most people who are intelligent would have overly panicked if he ended up doing some G League stints in his first year. But within his first year, he became so valuable to the Toronto Raptors that there was no chance to really develop him. You had to use him. You couldn't send him down to the G League. You couldn't just give him 10 games off to work on his jumper. No, he was immediately thrust into the starting lineup, and he led his entire team in minutes. Yes, the guy who people thought wouldn't start, might do G League stints, might not be ready to play for another 3 years, ended up leading his team in minutes for an entire year. Followed that up by doing it again in his second year, and followed it up by doing it again in his third year this year. I think this guy deserves a little bit of a benefit of the doubt. But I also think Bobby Webster and Masai Ujiri, despite some of their mistakes lately, deserve a little bit of a benefit of the doubt, because sometimes you can't see the whole timeline. You just can't, right? How many people, when Scotty was drafted, saw this moment coming? I think most people, even myself, I was surprised that he won Rookie of the Year. This is his biggest fan. I feel like I'm his biggest fan in the whole world. And even I was like, he beat Cade and Evan Mobley? That's shocking. Some people said it was because he's on a winning team. And he was, but he was a really big part of that winning team. And in his second year, the sights were set on 20 points per game. Let's see this Giannis projection. You win Rookie of the Year, suddenly you got eyeballs on you. And there's an adjustment period to that. You know, people draft you. You get drafted. It's all enthusiasm. It's all, like people are looking at you like, oh, you're the new guy, whatever. You're a rookie, you're the fifth option, whatever. And you just get to kind of coast into 15 points on offensive rebounds and drives to the rim and transition. But what happens when you become not the fifth guy in your team? What happens when you're on the scouting report? What happens when they know that you like to go this way or you can't turn over this shoulder? What happens when you get scouted? Your weaknesses get exposed. And man, did they get exposed. His handle got exposed. His jumper got exposed. His conditioning, everything in the world that he thought wasn't an issue became an issue, right? You saw teams going aggressive drop on him. You saw a team just backing off 20 feet and just saying, I dare you to shoot. And he said, okay, I'll pass. And it was frustrating. It was frustrating, and people thought it was the end of the world because this is the guy that you didn't trade Kevin Durant for. What the hell were you thinking? This is the guy you think is going to be Giannis. The projections came so low for Scotty, and I followed all of it from the Toronto media, from the average fan. I've sat in rooms with people who are season ticket holders who've said to me, he probably shouldn't even be starting. That was last year. I remind you, people have a tendency to be wrong about this guy. And in year 3, they were. He worked his butt off in the offseason, did an interview with Brian Macon, his trainer, in which we talked about everything that he did this offseason to make himself better. And, it was all catch and shoot. It was dribble drive. And look, you may not be super happy about his 3-point shooting, but you cannot deny that it is way better. And that when the season was going really well and when he had like better talent around him, that he was shooting much better. I think that if I told you that in his rookie year that he would ever shoot 35%, you'd be thinking I was crazy from 3, given where his jump shot was. And I've seen a lot of clips of Scotty working out with Brian, like back as 5 years, 6 years ago. Trust me, this was not easy to project at all. But the Raptors projected it. They trusted in themselves. They trusted in their draft process. They trusted that they could turn him into a star. And last year, it just didn't look very good. And a lot of things had to fall. And they had to make a choice. They had to make a choice. Are we right or are we wrong? Because he has regressed. Now, I want to make a very clear point. Last year, we spent a lot of time defending him. I think a lot of people have come out and said he didn't regress, that he flatlined. I want to make it clear that he did regress in his second year. There's a lot of things that did regress. His impact metrics regressed. His true shooting regressed. I think his defense regressed. I think there's a lot of things that you could say went the wrong way. They didn't just flatline, they did go down. And I think that sometimes we become prisoners of the moment and we start to look at things only as they are, and we become somewhat bearish about things without seeing the longer term trend. Because if you evaluate Scotty Barnes as a prospect over 5 years, you would see the growth chart. But if you evaluate him over 5 months, you might see a significant dip. And I think that it's important with young players to always try to do the micro macro switch. So it's important, I believe, to be aware of the trends as they're turning. For instance, like you say, bad body language, not getting back on defense. But I think it's important to then say, is this a pattern? Is this a pattern that's existed for 5 years? What do we do about it? I think it's important to say that when a player is in an extended shooting slump like he was last year, you can maybe say, okay, what's actually wrong with it? And are we still seeing growth year over year? Right? I think it's important to balance it out. Nevertheless, he did not have a good year last year. And I think that he struggled immensely with the increased pressure of defenses taking away things that he wants to otherwise do. He was moved up in the pecking order. He probably struggled. There was a lot of reports about him kind of clashing with some of his older teammates, some of the younger teammates clashing with older teammates, chemistry issues, vibes issues, etc. And I think the Raptors at this offseason, after that embarrassing play-in loss against the Chicago Bulls, they had to make a choice because they had a free agent, Fred VanVleet, who still probably held some hope that because this Scotty experiment was going so poorly for the Raptors, this on-ball experiment with this guy who can't dribble and can't shoot, that he had successfully managed to cement himself into the Raptors' needs. And I think the Raptors had some serious deliberations about that. I think they really turned every leaf and they asked themselves, if we let go of the sure thing, how sure are we of the unsure thing? You know, they must have talked to Scotty. They did. Of course they did. They looked at all the tape. They looked at his play-by-play data, his analytics, his tracking data. And I guess there was some mention this year of, from Masai Ujiri of, I wish I knew that he would take this jump. There's no way that you let Fred VanVleet go and shop Pascal Siakam as aggressively as they did in the offseason without there being a very, very serious projection that he would take a jump, that he would be better. Maybe you didn't expect 6, 8 box plus minus, because then you would be building very differently and you might have even brought back Fred. But the thing with, the what you did to influence what happened. And so, bringing back Fred, bringing back Nurse, etc. This version of Scotty, this version we saw earlier this year, if you could plant him onto last season's team, that's a 50-win team, no questions asked. I think that team should have been a 47-win team as is. It underperformed. The Raptors haven't been wrong too often, but they have been a little bit unfortunate. And I think that this entire Scotty Barnes thing could have gone a completely different way. And I think the Raptors were hoping that it would. I think they were hoping that Fred and Pascal and OG could grow with Scotty. I think they were hoping that they would be able to shield him from some of the pressures and immense pressures that he's probably feeling right now. That they can continue a winning environment, that they wouldn't have to do this entire rebuild, this gut and rebuild that they're doing right now, because they don't like losing. And I don't think Scotty likes losing. And Masai Ujiri doesn't like losing. And clearly this fan base does not tolerate losing either, which is a great thing. But I think that when he was at his lowest moments last year, questions about work ethic, questions about his jumper, questions about his training methods, questions about his will, his desire to compete. I think when he was at that low, to continue to bet on him, to continue to stand by the research from the pre-draft cycle, to continue to say that, yes, he's struggling, but we trust that he will turn it around. I believe that showed a great deal of faith in Scotty. And coming into this season, while as many people want to say that, they wanted to win and they wanted to give it a chance, and Bobby Webster has come out and said that they wanted to win and give it a chance, there's a really very, very serious, chance that they really didn't want to do that. That initially, they had this idea of wanting to trade Siakam in the offseason and tear this thing down and really rebuild the right way and rebuild around these younger pieces. And hopefully the piece they would have gotten back for Siakam in that trade from Atlanta. And that's just not how it happened. And so this entire season has become like a bit of a smorgasbord of different rosters and different projections, starting out 9-11 in the season, Pascal Siakam struggling, half the fan base losing its mind of like, why would you take your best player and freeze him out? The other half the fan base saying he's not the best player anymore. And I think both sides made a point. In terms of why I think the Raptors did what they did with Pascal Siakam, my thoughts on this are pretty clear, but two things that I think are worth noting. Number one, every single player that we were frustrated about how they were being used, how much they were playing, etc., has pretty much been traded. I was very frustrated early in the season that Malachi Flynn was playing so many minutes. Turns out he was traded. Some people were very frustrated with the extended opportunities that Precious Achiuwa got to play make, etc. He was also traded. Pascal Siakam being more of a corner spacer shooter. You saw him play yesterday with the Indiana Pacers, and if you're one of those fans who's following the Pacers, you've seen him play now, over 10 games with the Pacers. I think you can see that the role that he has in Indiana is much closer to the role that he had earlier with the Raptors, where he is doing a lot of corner spacing. He is doing a lot of secondary playmaking. And there's not a lot of like Pascal Siakam dominates the ball and, he's getting 29% usage. That's just not how teams were looking to use him. And so this was a calculated gamble on the Raptors side to have that conversation with Darko early and basically say, hey, this is how the teams that want to trade for him want to use him. They want to pair him with a dominant ball stopping, not ball stopping, but necessarily ball dominant guard or a superstar. They see him as a second guy. So can we exhibit him in that role? Can we exhibit him as a secondary option and see how he does at the things that are valuable for a second option, namely defense, shooting, cutting? And he was effective. He was efficient despite shooting absolutely horribly from three and despite shooting horribly, overall in his jumper and struggling defensively and struggling offensively and struggling with rebounding and a lot of hustle stuff. I think he really did pretty well in terms of just upping his efficiency and shot quality. And he was better. He was better in this offense, and I think this offense exhibited him. Did the Raptors get the return that they wanted? Nwara, Bruce Brown, and 3 picks? No. I don't think they got the return that they would have really wanted for him in the offseason. And I think there's a really good chance to, really good point to be made that had they actually traded him to a place where, maybe he didn't want to go, they probably could have gotten more. But they preserved the integrity. And I think the integrity is important. I think it's important. I think it's really important actually that you have a young player watching your every move with the previous star, right? If they'd shipped him to Detroit, what do you think those conversations would have been like when Scotty came when Pascal came back with Detroit? Do you think the vibes would have been so great? When Scotty Barnes sees the Raptors going out of their way, by the way, a funny thing, just a funny aside, I released a Twitter post, I think on January 19th, saying that the Raptors should give away give away what was it? They should give away Pascal Siakam jerseys when he comes back on February 14th because it would be so great for him to look up and see them in the stands because it's obviously so valuable to him. And I found it hilarious that they did exactly that. Nevertheless, I digress. Both OG, Precious, Pascal, all these people are thriving in their new roles. They're in great situations. Scotty's probably going to be sitting home watching them in the playoffs. And I think that if you're talking about a divorce, most divorces are very ugly. A lot of them in Raptors history have been very ugly. Under Masai Ujiri, apart from the DeMar DeRozan, situation, most of them have been very peaceful. And I think that that's an important thing to realize. One of the biggest reasons that you hire a president of this caliber and this magnitude is to shift the perspective of who you are as an organization around the league. Whether it was how they dealt with Kawhi and his load management, whether that's been how they've dealt with Fred VanVleet and his pending free agency, whether that was making sure that Kyle got to the place that he wanted, Fred got to the place that he wanted, every single player that I can think of, other than DeMar DeRozan, going to the Spurs and maybe not wanting to be there, etc. And even, giving DeMar to the Spurs is not a bad organization. They were a competitive team for a little while. He got great coaching. He became a better player. They've always done this thing, in my opinion, where they do their best by the players. Norman Powell going to Portland, to play with Dame, and then ending up in LA to play with Kawhi. Kawhi ending up where he wanted to go home. Never a leak, never any, bad mouthing, never any F that guy. It's a classy organization. And I got to tell you, as someone who lived through almost a decade when this wasn't a classy organization, it wasn't seen as a classy organization, it's a good thing because I think that it ups your chances of keeping this guy around long term, but also being the type of organization that can competently build around him. Because as much as you want to say that it's about hitting on the right draft pieces, at the end of the day, there's a lot of teams that draft the right guy and then lose him. Cleveland drafted the right guy, and LeBron James, they lost him. He came back because of, I don't know. I don't know why he went back. But they could have lost him forever with no championships, right? So it is important to have the management in place, but also the trust of a star. And I think that the way that they've dealt with OG Anunoby, with Pascal Siakam, with Nick Nurse, with everybody really, hopefully allows Scotty Barnes to see that he is really in some of the most competent, but also like, what's the word? Integrous, hands that have integrity. But now Scotty is here in year 3, and he is having a hell of a season by anyone's standards. He has been named an all-star. He is being talked about in the same light as many of the NBA's greatest players. He would join this weekend 23 other players, 24 other players, 23 other players to represent the Eastern Conference and represent the Toronto Raptors at the All-Star game. An honor that has not been enjoyed by a ton of Raptors in history. There's DeMar, there's Kyle, there's Pascal, there's Fred once, Vince Carter. There haven't been a ton of All-Stars. There have been plenty of All-Star games I've seen with no Raptors represented. So it's nice to see one being represented here. But it feels that this is the weirdest time in Raptors history because you still have an entire fan base saying he's not really going to be a number one. And I'm not sure he's a leader. And I'm not sure about this. And I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about his jumper. I'm not sure about his scoring. I'm not sure about all of this. So I think that it's important to realize that a player like this needs pieces around him that work. Pieces like this young man that they drafted 13th overall from Kansas. The chemistry between them is already palpable, right? They've only been playing together for a few months, and Grady's barely played at all. But you can see the chemistry sort of building up slowly between them. And these things take time. Scotty Barnes and RJ Barrett, you know, is this going to be a fruitful long term pairing? Certainly, after RJ missed that shot, Scotty Barnes coming over and dapping him up on the chest. I hope that went a really long way with RJ. But I also think that that's a sincere expression of empathy and support from a teammate that for the vast majority of your career wasn't your teammate. He was a rival in a conference in which you were better than him. And he was a rival in high school, when he was better than you. And now it's just like a complete adjustment to playing with this guy. I think as much as people have said that Jakob Poeltl, the trade was to help, Fred VanVleet, I think a lot of it was to help Scotty Barnes as well. Scotty Barnes was getting beat up playing centers. And with Jakob back in the lineup, he's taking a lot of those beatings for him. And I think that that's important. Is he the perfect piece? No, certainly not. You'd prefer a center who can shoot. And maybe that's why you traded for this guy. A lot has been made about Kelly Olynyk's potential unlocking or long-term unlocking of Emmanuel Quickley. And I think just as much as him unlocking Emmanuel Quickley, I think the player that will benefit most from Kelly's presence in Toronto will be Scotty Barnes. When you build around a player, it's important to understand who that player is, how they operate, and the type of roster to build around them. Roster building is an art and a science. And it comes down to meshing personalities, having a balance, but it also comes down to skill sets. And so sometimes it does feel like you're looking for a needle in a haystack because there aren't 2,000 NBA players. There are only so many. And maybe at any given time, only 150 to 200 are ever even available remotely in a trade. And so you can say all day that I want this type of player next to him. But where is that player? Do you have the assets to actually acquire them? Do they want to be here? Do you want them here? What's their contract status like? Does it work with the CBA? It's hard. It's hard to build a really great roster. This is not NBA 2K where everything is super easy and everyone's willing to trade everything for a first round pick. There are extenuating circumstances. Teams value, continuity a lot. And the Raptors haven't had a great deal of continuity. And right now, the Raptors are facing uncertainty. And I think a lot of people are really uncomfortable with that. Why have you bet on Scotty Barnes instead of just continuing this thing out with OG and Pascal? A lot of people are talking about how great former Raptors are doing elsewhere and maybe wondering, is Darko Rajakovic the problem? Is Toronto the problem? Right? Because Precious Achiuwa is averaging 14 plus points per game in the month of February. I want to remind you, he's doing it on 41 minutes per game. I think it's worth noting, right? Pascal Siakam has been better. OG Anunoby has been better. Everyone has been better who's left. Why? Because they've moved down in a pecking order. They've moved down. And moving down when your talent remains somewhat the same helps, doesn't it? If Scotty Barnes became a bench player for 15 minutes a game, he'd be the best bench player for 15 minutes a game in the world. But that's not who you're asking him to be. You're asking him to be a leader and a franchise player. And again, as I mentioned to start out this live, the Raptors have been wrong before. To some extent, I don't know if you could say they were wrong about DeMar DeRozan because he had a lot of success with DeMar, ton of success, and he built a great culture around him. But projecting him to be a playoff number one was probably the wrong move, and eventually you had to course correct. Chris Bosh was the wrong move. Andrea Bargnani was the wrong move. Rudy Gay was really, really a wrong move. Again, just because you get the franchise tag doesn't mean you're going to be successful in that tag. But why have the Raptors decided to build this thing around Scotty? A few reasons. Number one, they don't really have another choice. These guys don't grow on trees. You get what you can get. And the Raptors didn't draft Victor Wembanyama, Chet Holmgren, Paolo Banchero. They didn't draft these guys. They drafted Scotty Barnes. So, number one, they chose to draft him. So obviously they see something very, very, fruitful in him long term. But also, how many players in this league are genuinely worth building around? And how many players that are being built around currently do you project championships for? Do you project championships for the Orlando Magic with Paolo Banchero and Franz Wagner being their number one guys? I don't know. Do you project championships for Shea? Do you project championships for Luca? At the end of the day, the best player is going to win, right? There's going to be one champion, and then there's going to be like 7 people who tried, or 7 teams that tried and failed. And then there's going to be 24 other teams that probably never had a chance, but made it entertaining for somebody. And so I guess you got to ask yourself, how many players in the league would you rather build around than Scotty Barnes? And I think for most people, they could probably make a pretty long list. I can't. But maybe if you're one of those people that sees all the young players coming, all the young players expected to come, you might be thinking, this is a 30-team league. And if you have the least effective scoring first option in the NBA, you're going to be bad and you have no chance to be good. And I think that it's worth remembering how old most teams' first options actually are before we throw everything under the bus. Because the Raptors are expecting Scotty Barnes to get much better than this. When I say they've gone all in on him, I really do mean it. This doesn't work if he doesn't work. If he fails, this whole thing fails. There's literally nobody else on this roster that could even compare to his actual upside. There's a lot of guys who project to be third options, maybe some guys who you even could sell yourself on to being second options. Guys like Emmanuel Quickly, RJ Barrett, Grady Dick will all have a chance to some extent to be a little bit better than they've been. And hopefully that can project into something really good, right? I think Emmanuel Quickly is already a really good player, even though he's struggling with certain, defensive attention. I think Grady Dick is a very good player for his age. And I think he's very smart. And I think he could blossom into something very fruitful in the starting lineup for the Raptors as early as next season, maybe. I think RJ Barrett has a lot of potential to do things that maybe he didn't do in New York. Something about playing in transition, it unlocks certain players. And we've seen it before. You didn't see Sean Marion thriving in the half court. It was really in transition where, really he blossomed into like a star or an all-star. Sean Marion had a plethora of ball handling issues, shooting issues, funky shot, etc. But you have to find the right coach, the right fit, the right system, the right star, the, the right assistants, the right situation, the right roster build around them, the right chemistry. There's so many things that it's no wonder so many teams fail each year. There's no wonder, especially in a league that's this talented, that a team like the Detroit Pistons could lose as much as they have, or a team like San Antonio, despite having one of the brightest young stars in the NBA in Victor Wembanyama, could be as hopeless as they are on most nights. Even teams like Charlotte, that have like multiple high lottery picks, guys like Brandon Miller and LaMelo Ball, or teams like Portland Trailblazers. Look around the league and find me a team that just has no talent. That's just like the Charlotte Bobcats used to be, or that Bulls roster that I referred to with Marcus Fizer starting, or even the Cleveland Cavaliers roster that started Anthony Bennett. Find me a team that bad in the NBA today. You won't find one. The worst team in the NBA is a team that is bolstered by high lottery picks. All of them. Jaden Ivey, Cade Cunningham, Jalen Duren, like all of these guys. That team loses every night or every other night. They've lost a lot. Look at the San Antonio Spurs. They're coached by arguably the greatest coach of all time. They have the best prospect in 25 years. They have Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell. They have a lot of competent, they don't have a lot of competent players. Fine, that's cap. But they have enough that in some years they could be like a 25 to 28 win team. LeBron's roster with Cleveland, in his rookie year was trash. They had Junas Ilgauskas and him and a whole bunch of question marks across the board. I mean, they did have Carlos Boozer, I believe, in his first year. Um, that team still won like 37, 38 games, I believe. They just narrowly missed the playoffs. So you look at teams that are in like the 9, 10, and they may not win 14 games all year. And you're just like, wow, how hard is it to win in the NBA? And if you're a Raptor fan, you're like, how long will this losing last? How much more of this can I take? I was asked this question when I was at the Spurs game. How long do you think it's going to take? And I was sitting there, this dude that we went with, Vince. Some of you guys know Vince, the music guy. So we went to the box seats with his cousin, and his cousin was asking like, how long is this going to take? And he expected me to say 3 years. And I think a lot of people right now are thinking this is going to take 3 years, that in order for this and this and this and this and all of this to work, that we're going to be talking about 3 years. And in 3 years, Scotty Barnes is going to be 25. And in 3 years, we'll be talking, about him being 2 years away from potentially being an unrestricted free agent. And there'll be a lot of question marks at that point. Is this really going to take 2 years? This is going to be another Chris Bosh situation where the roster becomes so terrible right when he becomes the main guy. None of your other roster pieces work around him. Remember Chris Bosh when the Raptors turned it over to him, right? They traded Jalen Rose. Soon they traded Danielle Marshall. And then you had an entire rebuild around Chris Bosh. It worked for like a year in 2006 when Brian Colangelo took over, but look at the distance between 2004, 2005, 2006, like how long it took. You had the year where Vince Carter got traded for Eric Williams, Aaron Williams, and Alonzo Mourning, who did not report. That sucked that he didn't report. But that team was really bad. It was really hard to watch. Mike James and, Rafael Arujo and Joey Graham and Chris Bosh. And we as Raptor fans are traumatized by this. And so I guess it's a fair question to ask. Are we about to head into a similar phase with Scotty? He's even wearing the numbers. He's wearing the same goddamn number as Chris Bosh, number 4. But I think what separates this number 4 and that number 4 is a lot, frankly. I think Scotty this year has shown me, and throughout his career has shown me, that his projection as a player is actually much, much, much higher. I think there are games he's already had, including his game against Cleveland, including his game against Indiana, which trump any game that I saw from Chris Bosh in his first 2.5 years. Literally any game. There's nothing that Chris Bosh did to show me that he was going to be this good. I remember a 25-point game against Kevin Garnett and the Minnesota Timberwolves where people lost their minds because he had a reverse layup laid on Kevin Garnett. I think he had a big block in that game too. And I think a lot of people started to dazzle themselves on the potential of Chris Bosh. And I really, at the time, do not remember a lot of people chastising this back then. It seemed logical to build around Chris Bosh. Once Vince Carter left, Chris was really embraced by this fan base. I remember this as a teenager, this happening back then. You can correct me in the comments if you think I'm wrong, but I firmly remember this fan base having like great attitudes towards a rebuild. And I think very soon after, people started to worry that maybe Bosh was not, the guy. Way too smoky saying Bosh had me hyped. Exactly. He had me hyped too. The first few years, I think I really saw the vision of maybe he could be like a Kevin Garnett or a Tim Duncan type, maybe a light version of those. At the very least, maybe he could be a Chris Webber. He turned into more of a Antonio McDyess level guy, right? I mean, despite, or maybe like an Antonio McDyess mixed with Robert Ory, mixed with, maybe a little bit Chris Webber. Like it was a second, third option. And I think that sucked for Raptor fans because, you didn't have playoff success despite going to the playoffs. I want to say 2 times in Chris's career. First, I think there was there was the Nets series. And then the next year there was the Orlando series, but there was a lot of lottery picks, a lot of losing, a lot of ugly losses. And it was just a sad time to be a Raptor fan. And given the success that this franchise has enjoyed, and given the, reputation that you've built, to lose all of that, now and to reinitiate this process when a lot of people felt like it didn't need to be done. You could have been successful with Pascal. He wasn't 40. He wasn't 38. He didn't demand a trade. I think this entire situation is different if Pascal and Fred demand a trade. No, you chose to let them go. And I think that that is the problem that a lot of people have with this situation. Really. Because this is a fan base that has been permanently scarred by people leaving and not wanting to be here. So when you listen to a guy like Pascal Siakam say, I wanted to be here forever, that this is my home, you remember back to players of his magnitude and maybe even players better than him not wanting to be here, spurning your requests for them to be here. You remember Kawhi leaving. So this is why there's always an affinity towards guys who actually wanted to be here. Guys like Fred VanVleet, guys like that, right? And I think at some point, you know, this fan base needs to realize that the same guy who told you to believe in yourselves, believe in this city, that he's walking the walk. And he doesn't think the way you think, or not specifically you, but most Raptor fans think about we should just be happy that people want to be here. I think too many people have treated this organization like that for a very long time. I tell you this as an American that a lot of American people feel like Toronto should just be thankful. Toronto should just be thankful that somebody like that wants to be there. Deciding to part ways with an all NBA, two-time all NBA, two-time, all-star, deciding to just say, no, we don't want to pay you. We're going to move off of this, even though we can pay you. Fred VanVleet's gone. They could have paid Pascal. They could have paid Pascal. Just to clarify, they could have paid Pascal. They could have paid Fred. Lord knows MLSE is wealthy enough to do it. They chose not to. They chose to let Fred VanVleet walk. And a lot of people were upset. I think some people are more upset now than they were actually in the moment. But, people like to be pissed off. And this is something to be pissed off about. You lost him for nothing. And he's still one of the 15 best point guards in the league. And you can make a very strong case that he's a better player right now than Emmanuel Quickley, and he's definitely a much better player than Dennis Schroeder. So you got worse on that position because you didn't want to pay, and now you're going to pay Emmanuel Quickley, 25 to 27 million, when, maybe you didn't want to pay Fred VanVleet 35. I think some people are upset about all these things because there's some real good times attached to the aforementioned players. Guys like Fred VanVleet and Pascal Siakam and OG Anunoby became like the emblems for the greatest stretch in Raptors history. But I think that it is important for Raptor fans to divorce the idea of being a part of something and being the reason for something. Because I think that that's the realization that the Toronto Raptors themselves came to. That there is a difference between participating in the success of a company and being the reason or the originator of the culture or the reason that a company is successful. I've often talked about WWE and WWF, etc. A good example that comes to mind is Vince Russo. To those of you who watch WWE, a 1-minute tangent on this. In 1997, 1996, there was a Monday Night Wars between the WCW and the WWF at the time. And it was all a soap opera, right? Who has the best matches, who has the best talent, etc. And one of the talent heads and one of the creative directors and one of the best minds in the business at the time was Vince Russo, working for the WWF. And it just felt like he was just such a genius that throwing money at him from WCW without the backing of Vince McMahon, who's going through a world of controversies right now, and he's a despicable person. But I want to say that bringing him over without Vince did not yield positive results for WCW. He drove that company into the ground. Most people are on record saying that. What I'm saying is you can be a successful part of something. It doesn't mean that once the leaders are removed, that you can step into that vacuum and lead yourself. Some people are just not cut out for it. And I think the Toronto Raptors had this, sort of vision of Kyle passing the torch to Fred, and you know DeMar passing the torch to, or Kawhi passing the torch to Pascal, and they thought, let's just rinse and repeat this whole thing again. And I think Tampa caught them a little off guard. I think the bubble caught them off guard. I think the first season that Scotty Barnes was here, I think there was a little bit of optimism, but that optimism quickly went away when the team struggled last year. And so while most Raptor fans were a little bit miffed at the idea that the Raptors would trade something as valuable as a first round pick and multiple picks, to bolster that core with guys like Thaddeus Young and then another first round pick for a guy like Jakob Poeltl. And as much as I would be against those moves at the time and in hindsight, I think that this showed, hopefully, that team, and hopefully showed Raptor fans that they really believed in this idea of passing the torch, that they really believed in this continuity of success that the San Antonio Spurs had. But you see, once again, once Tim Duncan retired and Kawhi Leonard was elevated to the very top, there were no more championships. They never won another championship. The Spurs have won four championships, five championships. All of them were with Tim Duncan. Once he retired, it was over. Kawhi Leonard was a great player, but the structure that held him where he was in that organization, the structure that held everything together had been removed. The tenets, the tent poles, the foundation had been rattled. And it's one thing to say, you can grow a guy into it, but sometimes you literally have to just start over. And I think the Spurs, as close as they are to the Toronto Raptors, because I think the Raptors have really admired R.C. Buford and Greg Popovich and what they do over in the Spurs. You think about really what they're trying to do, and you'll see the parallels. They're trying to implement a motion offense that is a very European thing. Greg Popovich, Darko Rajakovic, probably a world of difference between those two guys in terms of, personality, but in terms of basketball philosophy, preaching, movement, preaching, all of these things, I think that there are some similarities there. You talk about the continuity between, passing the torch from Robinson to Duncan to Kawhi, or to Manu, to Kawhi, building a competent roster, building, this sort of like long-term success, being good at the draft, being like everything that the Raptors are basically copying the Spurs' homework at this point, right? And the Spurs tried to do this thing too, where they were so desperate when they were trading Kawhi that they wanted another star back. They didn't want to become irrelevant. They're a small market team. They wanted to compete for playoffs, and they made a mistake at that time, because if they had traded Kawhi for draft picks, they probably would have been better sooner. But they fall ass backwards into Victor Wembanyama and Say Levy. But it's worth noting that no player on the Spurs roster today ever played with Tim Duncan. I'm confident in saying that there's no player on the Spurs today that's even played with Kawhi Leonard. They built completely from the ground up. They decided to do what the Raptors are doing now. The difference is, I believe the Raptors are ahead of them. You may say the Spurs are ahead of them because they have a guy that a lot of people think might become one of the 5 greatest players of all time, Victor Wembanyama. But I will say, in terms of the overall roster build, they might be just as far behind, if not a little bit further behind, than the Raptors. And I think that, for the Raptors, there have been a lot of mistakes that they have made over the last, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, that have been considered miscalculations. Not trading aging stars as they were going out, losing them for nothing, draft mistakes like Malachi Flynn. Some people even think right now that the trading OG Anunoby, Precious Achiuwa, et cetera, might come back and bite them in the butt, because RJ Barrett is maybe not your cup of tea and Emmanuel Quickley is struggling. I think it remains to be seen how great the Raptors will be and how soon. But my honest projection is that it will be much, much closer to a 1-year timeline than a 3-year timeline. I'm not saying that it's going to be exactly 1 year. It might be less. I am saying, however, that by next year, around the All-Star break, I expect to see a pretty good team on the floor. And that will be just enough time for the pieces to have gelled together for whatever the Raptors do this offseason to be implemented into what they're doing. And maybe that doesn't mean that they win 47 games next year. Maybe that means that they compete for a play-in next year. And maybe that excites absolutely nobody. But please understand that this is exactly the shift that was needed and required for this team to move forward. The CBA will hamstring you into, it's gonna lock a lot. You look around the league, there aren't a lot of bad contracts. Would you agree? Bradley Beal, Zach LaVine are the two names that come to mind all the time. But other than that, you really can't think about a ton of um, someone saying Kawhi is the reason the Raptors won the chip, not the team. You're wrong. I think the Raptors are the reason they won a championship. I think there's a lot of players who contributed to that, and I don't understand. Um, Ja is 10 times better than Banrez. I don't know who Banrez is, but cool. Um, okay. I don't think Ja Morant is 10 times better than Scotty Barnes. I think that's pretty stupid. But yeah, that's just my opinion. Um, I think that the Raptors have a competent roster, and I think that for the first time in a long time, this is a roster that makes sense to me. I've complained for years that this roster didn't make a hell of a lot of sense, that it seemed like a farm factory of like prospects and development prospects that weren't quite developing as opposed to an actually functional basketball team. There are things you need on a basketball court like shooting, dribbling, passing, playmaking. You need depth, you need veterans, you need a lot of things to be successful in the NBA, clearly. And to have those pieces around a playmaker as gifted as Scotty Barnes, I think they have correctly, in my opinion, done this in in spurts, right? They probably had a vision this offseason that, hey, over the next year, we got to do one, two, three, four, five, six, seven things, right? And it didn't matter if they were all done in one go in last offseason and you come into this season with the brand new roster and the entire teardown. I think step one was obviously replacing Nick Nurse with a more development friendly coach who wasn't going to bitch and complain about losing for a year and, who had the trust of Scotty Barnes and maybe could implement the type of offense that Scotty wanted to play. I think the second thing was surrounding Scotty with shooters, right? And they slowly are starting to do that. We're seeing Grady Dick going off every other night, 4 for 5 from three. A few nights ago, that was really interesting to see. Despite the fact that the Raptors got blown out, he's showing flashes everywhere. You can see that shooting is a real focus of every single player coming back. And I suspect that they'll continue to focus on shooting, focus on, trying to find 3-and-D guys that can fit around this team, developing the shooters that they have now that they have a competent, training staff that can actually do that for you. Developing Scotty as a shooter, developing IQ as an even better shooter than he already is, developing RJ as a shooter. I've seen a lot of positive growth from a lot of players on this team. If you watched RJ Barrett in New York, not quite this playmaker, not quite this finisher, and I think he's having some of the best success that he's ever had in his NBA career. This is really the Raptors returning to who they've been. They've been the guys who find assets that are undervalued and properly develop them. That's who they've been under Masai Ujiri's entire tenure. Ironically, that's who Masai Ujiri is. He was an underrated general manager that the Raptors brought in and completely shifted everything. I think that, you take a guy like DeMar DeRozan, give him a different situation. He doesn't become this player, but he had this trajectory and it worked. The Raptors have taken guys like DeLon Wright, Pascal Siakam, Norman Powell, and turned them into really good players. And they did that through development. And I think that this development thing is frustrating because a lot of things haven't gone right for the Raptors in terms of development. They've traded a lot of first round picks, second round picks have been basically duds. Even the one who actually did work out and was going to work out in Christian Coloco, unfortunately, the health, holds him out. How far did the Raptors fall back? Masai Ujiri once said, Tampa put them back like 5 years. I believe that's the exact quote. And I didn't understand it at that moment. And now we're almost 4 years removed from them being in Tampa, or 3 years removed from them being in Tampa. And I'm just like, I think I get it. I think I actually get it. And I'm trying to understand just exactly like what they lost, you know? And I think that it is basically that they lost. I still don't completely understand what they lost. I'm just being honest. I still don't completely understand how it equates to 5 years, but you can feel it. You can feel a complete disruption in the regulated, pathways of certain players. You can feel disruption in the development of Pascal Siakam, when he was there. And I got to say, I want to cap this off by saying that I have an increased empathy now for Pascal Siakam, more so than I did, 4 years ago or 5 years ago. Because again, as I've grown as a human being, I've come to become more empathetic. I think hopefully you become more empathetic with age and try to be a little less judgmental of people when they're going through things that you don't completely understand. And kind of understanding that even though I very swimmingly walked through the pandemic, like no problems, whatever, I didn't have any, serious concerns about it. Understanding how people deal with change and how people deal with uncertain times is actually something that I'm researching a lot lately. And it's something that's really come to light now that Scotty is dealing with something that is not as serious as a pandemic. But of course, the shifting of the team around him, the shifting of the role, adjusting to new expectations, etc. And so it is giving me a lot of empathy for, what players in his shoes go through. And I wonder if, did we ever extend that same empathy to Pascal Siakam, having to lead a team for the first time in the playoffs? The bubble is always chalked up to he didn't touch a basketball for 4 months. But could the bubble also be, um, the emotional toll and pressure that it takes on a player to be the first option when they maybe not ready to be a first option? And he bounced back from that. And I feel like I didn't give him enough credit at the time for bouncing back to that because it was just taken for granted that that's who he is. That's what he's supposed to do, you know? And I wonder if now, as a very big Scotty Barnes fan, as I'm observing other people do this to him, it is making me a lot more mindful of how I feel about how I acted during that entire period, right? Um, like I didn't look at him not touching the basketball for 4 months. I've never ever, um, I've never fully understood it, and I've never fully been able to say, yeah, that's perfectly okay, and that's perfectly normal, and that's completely understandable, and I totally get it. I've never had that level of empathy for it. My thought process at the time was, you're a professional basketball player. You should have found a way to get to a gym, and that was my bad because again I'm projecting my own what I would have done, what somebody else would have done. But what he did in that moment, given what the pressures that he was facing at the time, I think that that's worth thinking about now. And I think that when you look at young players around the league who've been thrust into the first option role, thrust into leadership roles, I think there's always a delicate balance between how much, how soon. You know, you could say Zion right now. Is Zion at, he's been in the league longer than Scotty. Is he the leader? Be honest. Is he the leader of the New Orleans Pelicans? Right? How long was it before Kobe Bryant was the leader of the Los Angeles Lakers? When was Vince anointed the leader of the Toronto Raptors? How old was he? Or did we always kind of see guys like, at least in his first few years, saw guys like Doug Christie, Antonio Davis, Charles Oakley? Weren't those the leaders? When did Vince transcend that and become the leader? I'm pretty sure he was close to 25 when it happened. When's the last time the Toronto Raptors had a 22-year-old leader? I think you probably have to go back to Chris Bosh, right? Chris Bosh is probably the last guy. There wasn't a lot of leadership around him. That was a haplessly, stupidly constructed roster. And the second you brought in actual leaders, guys like Anthony Parker, Rasha Nesterovich, Jorge Garbajosa, the whole thing shifted. Leadership was not Chris Bosh's jam. I don't think he's been a leader, as a basketball player. Maybe in his life, maybe in community, he's been a leader. But on a basketball team, I don't think I remember the last time Chris Bosh was a leader since high school. Even at Georgia Tech, you can make a case he wasn't the leader. So I look at that and I'm just like, how close are the Raptors? I think they are as close as they might be 2 pieces away and 1 year away. 2 pieces being Two pieces that are functionally needed to replace the pieces that exist in their place right now. And how do you upgrade on a Gary Trent Jr. and a Bruce Brown? I do not know. How you develop an RJ Barrett, Scotty Barnes, Emmanuel Quickly, etc., that is clearer to me. But Johnny saying, when's the last time an NBA team had a 22-year-old leader? I think you could say Luka Doncic, LaMelo Ball, Anthony Edwards, Anthony Davis is probably another example. There have been some. I'm not saying that Scotty Barnes is in uncharted territory. I am, however, saying that a lot of those teams lost early, right? How quickly could the Raptors be better? I think, like, okay, let me play a hypothetical game. How close is it? What if you replaced Jakob Poeltl with Rudy Gobert right now? Just upgrade the defensive pressure on the defense that much, right? Dylan Shoot saying, do you know what box of spine is Grady is flashing during his recent performances? Absolutely, I do. And I'm going to take a 2-minute break to tell you about that. Thank you so much for the super chat. I would share my screen with you so I can guide you through Grady's recent performances. They have been very good, just an FYI. So hang on one second. Johnny saying Kevin Garnett. Absolutely. 100%, man. Okay. So here's Grady Dick. And I'll actually show you a way that you guys can do this yourself. It's actually really simple. So you go down to right here, you go down to the advanced box score, and you can see all of his games right here. So this is kind of where he started, right? Minnesota, Chicago, -17, -17. Then he had a -21 against Milwaukee. Sorry, I can make this a little bit bigger for you guys. Sorry about that. Okay, so we started with a lot of negatives. We had a complete meltdown against Dallas, a complete meltdown against Boston. Like, I don't think you understand how bad you have to be -32 boxes minus. Like, you have to be literally abysmal. Like, to put it into perspective, Steph Curry has played an entire career, and I don't think he's ever flashed those numbers while playing over 10 minutes, ever. So it's not just like, oh, it happens every once in a while or whatever. And if you understand how boxless minus works, you'd understand, like, this is seriously bad. He played 10 minutes and was terrible. Continuing on, here's the recent stretch. And overall, it has been very encouraging since he got back. So he started here at positive 21.4, went all the way to 10.1. Then he flashed an 8.0 against San Antonio, this game right here, where he was really brilliant and he hit like those 4 threes. He was great. He had a 7.4 against OKC. So it's just encouraging to see that it's not dependent on him playing bad teams. In fact, doing it against New York in, again, 16 minutes was really positive. So he's had his best games. Let me just show you where his best games have been. So, like, I get discouraged, not that I need to, but I get discouraged when your best games are against all the worst teams in the league. Like, when you look at a guy like, I don't know, and you say, like, who are your best games against? Detroit, Charlotte, San Antonio. It was like, okay. So you're thriving against, like, bad defenses. He's not. He's not at all. There's a healthy mix of where his best games have been. So his most positive games, his only positive games really, from in terms of boxes minus, have come against Cleveland, Philadelphia, Charlotte, New Orleans, OKC, San Antonio, New York, Washington, Philadelphia, Miami. Miami being his best game. The Philadelphia thing probably shouldn't count because he only played 2 minutes. So you can pretty much scrap that. And maybe Washington shouldn't count because he only played 5 minutes. But every other game has been overwhelmingly positive. And I think if you're really, really looking for, like, the best Grady game in terms of just overall, you probably look at New Orleans. And it's ironic. And I thought that it was a great statement game from him because ultimately, a lot of people have talked about how the Raptors should have drafted Jordan Hawkins. And I just thought that it was a really great thing for him, specifically, to be able to, at least for one game, really show against Jordan Hawkins, who didn't really play very much that game, to really show that, hey, like even in the midst of a loss, and even though my team is doing poorly, like I'm a good player. I'm a good NBA player. I'm very very happy for him. Um, Honestly, I think Grady is going to be a really huge part of the Raptors' next chapter in their turnaround, and I hope that Raptor fans are really excited about him. But I'll tell you right now, 2 months ago, as this channel very sternly stood behind Grady Dick, and I have never wavered on that, not 1 second. Like from summer league to preseason to the season, like through this entire stretch of -20 and -30s, I was just like, nope, just have patience, have faith, because he's going to be good. Um, Too often this channel gets branded as some sort of Scotty Barnes super fan channel. I love Scotty. I think he's a fantastic player, but that doesn't mean that we tear down other players. There was a comment that I recently saw where someone said, this is a channel that has been built on hating on certain players, and now, you've lost all your fuel. Are you kidding me? I sleep so much better now knowing that the Dennis Schroeders and the Fred VanVleets of the world are off this team. I'm happy. I'm a happy camper. And as much as, I'm not saying like it's perfect. Obviously, I would prefer that the Raptors be 4 games above 500 right now, and I would feel so much better if they were a better team right now. I got to tell you, nothing that I'm seeing right now is leading me to believe that they won't be good really soon. So I wanted to say that, and yeah, I think I'm happy for Scotty. I'm really happy for Scotty. He's gonna be at the All-Star game. I'm happy that his teammates are happy for him. The reaction from Pascal Siakam, an ex-teammate of his, when he was announced, and when he had this moment with Bobby Webster, like again, it's a continuation of this moment. It's a continuation of this moment right here. And it's a journey, man. It's a journey, and let's just be real about it. Like a lot of people did not see this coming, and so I'm just reminding Raptor fans to be patient. I'm preaching patience. I feel like a politician right now in that I'm preaching patience every single night, because it is going to be ugly sometimes, and it's going to look beautiful sometimes. Against Indiana in the first half, it looked beautiful. Against Miami, it looked beautiful. These are not bad teams. These are the very same teams that you're going to need to beat next year. Caitlin Cooper, I ended up watching Samson and Caitlin's post-game breakdown of the Indiana Pacers Toronto Raptors. Just curious to see what she thought. And she said that the Indiana Pacers basically were facing themselves to some extent. That was essentially what she said, was that having a team run it down your throat in transition and just like push it, and you not being able to do anything and get into the paint at will, and splashing threes or whatever. The Raptors weren't really hitting threes in the Indiana game, but they were just like pushing the pace against the Pacers. It felt a little bit like looking in the mirror. And I think that unlike, building around a Donovan Mitchell, a Devin Booker, a LaMelo Ball, a Trae Young, or a plethora, really, when you look at the top players in the league, look at the players that teams are actually building around, how many of them are defensive or injury liabilities? Think about it. Really think about it. When you're talking about Zion, injuries. What about personality? And we're talking like, off court issues. Now, I really like Ja Morant, but like you would be crazy if you didn't think that the last 2 years have done a lot to dampen his trajectory. There's injuries, there's all sorts of things, and injuries can happen to anybody. But this idea that you have a player that plays both ends of the basketball court, like he plays offense and defense, is important. His analytics prove that he is truly one of the better players in the NBA. He's one of the earlier in the season, maybe he was closer to the 25th best player in the NBA, and currently he is, let's say, a little bit closer to. He was earlier in the year. I think he was closer to like. I think it'd be fair to say that he was like closer to the 10th to 15th best player in the NBA. You cannot make the case that he was like absolutely surrounded by so much talent that it was just elevating him. It wasn't that at all. Um, But I think overall, like his impact metrics have fallen down a lot since the roster around him has changed. And I think part of that is on him, but I also think part of that is on the team around him. But I think one thing that remains unchanged is that there aren't a lot of teams that can check the boxes that the Raptors can with Scotty Barnes. When you consider a player who believes in team first basketball, sort of the Victor Wembanyama, Tim Duncan, LeBron James, that sharing the wealth, not, being a selfish guy, whatever, that is an important thing for me. It may not be super important for you, but it's an important thing for me that my leaders be givers, right? My leaders be generous and my leaders care about their teammates. What about personality issues? Zero red flags in 10 years. There's not one case of Scotty Barnes getting in trouble. There's nothing like that. You can nitpick at body language. You can nitpick at complaining to the referees. These are very, very tame, mild examples of aggression that a lot of people, tend to hone in on because there isn't a hell of a lot to complain about right now. So they want to complain about something. Things are not going well. So whatever, they're going to complain. So yeah, you can nitpick the jump shot, you can nitpick this, you can nitpick the handle, you can nitpick at a lot of things, but the truth is you're checking a lot more boxes than you are right now. You know, you have a guy with the physical skill set. You know how many teams out there are building around guys that maybe in an ideal world are too small, guys like Jalen Brunson or Trey Young. What about guys who are too old, like Kevin Durant? What about guys who are defensive liabilities like Luka Doncic, Trey Young, etc.? What about guys who maybe have injury histories like Zion Williamson? When you actually stack up Scotty Barnes next to every young player that teams around the league are building around, you really come to see him as one of the top 10, top 12, guys in the league that you would want to start a franchise with if you could have like an overall draft, right? I think most people would probably say that they'd rather start a team with Shea, probably start a team with Luca, Anthony Edwards. There's a lot of guys like this. But also, none of those guys have come as far as Scotty has over the last 2-3 years. So I think that the Raptors, despite all of the bumps and bruises that they've gone through with Scotty Barnes, as a first option, despite the regression that was last year, despite all the roster turnover, despite the success, despite the failures, despite all of it, I believe that overall that they are still banking that the player that they drafted is destined to be a superstar. And I, for one, am very, very much looking forward to that superstar being at his first All-Star game. I think it's going to be really fun for him. He's going to hang out with family, and I hope that he comes back this year and finishes strong. One of the things that his trainer has always preached, and interestingly, following Brian has been very. I don't know if he's ever going to see this, but and maybe I should say this directly to him, and I'm sure I have to some extent. But following him and even brief conversations with him has been a really good thing for me as well. The way that guy grows people is insanity. And one of the things he always preaches is finishing strong, finishing the year strong, finishing the season strong. And that's the person who's in his year, someone who always preaches finishing strong. So I don't think Scotty Barnes is going to limp to the finish line. I think Scotty Barnes is going to coast the finish line. And I think really at this point, it isn't even a battle of Scotty versus the league or Scotty versus the media, Scotty versus this guy, Scotty versus a teammate, Scotty versus Fred, Pascal, Nick Nurse, etc. I think at this point, it's just Scotty versus himself. And I think he's going to get better. And every single, oh my God, I didn't see this coming. That happens pretty much every year with Scotty Barnes, right? Like first year, you didn't see him leading the team in minutes and winning rookie of the year. Second year, you didn't see him taking a huge step back. This year, you didn't see him coming out being 8, 9, 3, 7 box plus minus. You probably saw him being marginally better across the board. I think most people would have just settled for 17 points per game. But flashing 21, 22 points per game, like pretty much, let me just put this in perspective by sharing my screen for a second. Do you know that Scotty Barnes over the last 4 games, 2 of which, by the way, have been absolutely terrible games, just to put that into perspective, do you know he's pretty much averaging a triple-double? Let me just show you like what he's done the last 4 games, because it is friggin' insane. So these are his last 4 games. Over his last 4 games, he's averaging 18.3 points, 10.3 rebounds, 8.8 assists, 1.3 steals, 1.3 blocks. That includes 2 very bad games. Okay, yeah, it includes 3 losses too. But I think, like, it's worth noting that these are the bad games now. This is where we've come to with him, that he could have 2 bad games and 2 good games and come out looking like an all-star. Because really 18, 10, and 10, or 18, 10, and 9, or where were we? Hang on. Sorry, I have like 18, 10, and 9, basically. That's what it is. 18, 10, and 9 with a block and 1.3 blocks and 1.3 steals. Okay, the three-point shooting is terrible. The free throw shooting is great. The field goal percentage is not great. I get it. You know, he's shooting 15% from 3 during that run. But he's not playing a ton of minutes. It's not like Precious Achiuwa where he's playing 41 minutes a night. You know, maybe if he's playing 41 minutes a night instead of 34 minutes a night, we're talking about 20 points, 10 assists, 11 rebounds. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about friggin', we're talking about all-star 22. And that's exactly what he is right now. He's an all-star 22. And I'm excited to see him. And I hope that he has a brilliant weekend. And I hope that he, continues to prove people wrong, because he's been doing it for years. He's really been doing it for years. And I'm excited for him. And I hope that you're excited for him. And I hope that if you're a Raptor fan, that you give him a chance, as we have given many people a chance. And regardless of your feelings about this is not going to work, this is not going to work, please know that trained professionals who know a hell of a lot more about basketball than yourself or me have made this very educated decision to, after knowing him and knowing him for 2 years and scouting him for 6 years, they've come to the conclusion that this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy is worth building around. They have come to the conclusion that this guy is a leader and he is a hell of a lot better than Chris Bosh, and that he is someone that is worth moving off of a sure thing that is maybe not so sure, in the sense that a lot of people feel like, hey, you moved out Pascal and Fred and et cetera, et cetera. I don't think the Raptors wanted to. I think they just read the tea leaves and said that they've run out of time. I think a lot of people maybe have a little bit of animosity towards Scotty because they see him as the reason that those guys were moved. And I think that that's where the misplaced blame goes. And we call it false consciousness when we blame somebody for something that is actually somebody else's fault, right? Because the truth is that I don't think Scotty failed the Raptors. I don't think he failed his teammates. He's ahead of schedule. He's ahead of what you would have expected. If I told you when he was drafted that at this point in his career that he would be leading his entire draft class in, in value of a replacement, I think you'd probably say I was crazy. I think if I told you he was 10th, you'd probably say that's realistic. There's a lot of upperclassmen. There's a lot of guys that are better than him. He's a reach at 4. Maybe by 25, you'll be good. And it's just like at this point, he's really, really fucking good at 22. And we still have a lot to complain about because things aren't going well for the team. So just noting that, again, when you go into Walmart and there's a policy in place and you don't agree with that policy, you're like an average person. You probably get mad at the cashier for the policy. But that's false consciousness. That's why frontline employees exist. So that because you don't have the CEO's access or the manager. So really at this point, Scotty is just doing the best with what he has. I think he's really trying his best. I think the losing sucks for him, but I hope that this message also extends to him that be patient and enjoy this moment and, grow with it and live with it, because again, some very smart people have made an educated decision that you are someone worth building around. And again, to reiterate, I don't believe that the Raptors chose Scotty Barnes over Pascal Siakam or, OG Anunoby or whatever. I think they did what was necessary to ensure the future success of the franchise. And sometimes, in order to ensure your continued survival, you need to take a really, really painful dose of medicine. And I think that the last year and this year are probably that painful dose of medicine. I think they are that bitter taste in your mouth before you get better. And yeah, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, I don't think people will be complaining very much. Just like people weren't complaining about Chris Bosh leaving for nothing when the Raptors were starting WeTheNorth. And I don't think people were complaining too much about DeMar DeRozan getting traded when they were running a championship parade. People forget. But in the moment, it feels hard. In the moment, we all become prisoners of the moment. We all start overreacting. I've certainly overreacted to Dennis Schroeder, Fred VanVleet, whatever. But at the end of the day, these are passing figures in your organization. There are permanent fixtures in your organization, and one of them is about to enjoy his first All-Star game. I hope he enjoys it. I want to thank you guys for listening to me ramble poetically or unpoetically. I hope that this made some sense and this was of value to somebody. Um, yeah. Sorry, I'm looking at some of these comments. Um, Passes and tickets have been flying off the hizzy for Pendants. There are 12 more tickets left for the Pensari basketball giveaway. So I will flash this trailer one final time. We shared this trailer on Instagram via the Pendants Film Festival Instagram channel. And thankfully it was shared by Cinema One More. So it got like 10,000 views. So I was very happy about that. But yeah, so this film is coming to, thanks a lot, man. This film's coming on Saturday next week. We're a week away from Pendants, man. Holy shit! Like next week, you won't. I'll do some lives from Pendants, maybe. Like I'll do like one or two, or I'll do some after. But yeah, like you're probably not going to hear a lot from me on Saturday and Sunday. So I hope that you're there on Saturday and we can meet. But yeah, this film world premiere coming on Saturday. Link is in the description. And there's a special gift for you as a Pensari basketball follower. You can get free tickets for it. So grab up to 2. And come with a buddy, come with a friend, come with your lady, whatever, and come watch the world premiere of this film. All right, take care.
They're off. Cube had a good beginning, so too did Red Mule. Red Mule to the front. Amistad is there on the outside. Then it's Hallstatt, followed by Deft along the rail. Bridge to the Future is next, and then Lone Pioneer, who's 6 lengths off the lead, clear 2.5 from Power Boss. Lid's Boy to the inside, and Don Chicho is last. Up the backstretch, Red Mule the leader, 3/4 of a length ahead of Deft running in second as the field moves for the far turn. And then it's Cube in third, 22.97 that first quarter mile. Amistad is fourth on the outside. Behind that one is Power Boss. And then comes Don Chicho and Lid's Boy. They're coming to the top of the stretch, 45.3.5. For front running Red Mule. And then toward the inside, it's Hallstatt.
This is gonna fucking make us. This is the thing.
They're all chasing the Red Mule. Hallstatt, a long shot, makes a late.
Ow! No fucking excuse, Jose! Go on, Jose! Get up, Jose!
The hook is that they're bred to run and they're bred to lose. They were invented to lose.
This is the plight of man. First you gotta sink really low and get in slime. And from slime, that's how man was created.